right, so I guess we should get started. People can keep, Ian's going to keep admitting people, but today we're going to hear about Councilman Hinds had introduced the overlay. Well, I guess it started a long time ago with Wayne New, but this is Councilman Hinds' initiative. And he's not here, but Libby Kaiser is going to present and bring us up to date on where we are. So let's see, do you want to share the screen?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and pull up a presentation that I can walk through, and then we can address any questions that you all may have afterwards.
Okay, see if I gave you.
I think I have permission.
Okay.
You all can see my presentation?
Yes.
All right, perfect. So good morning all. Thanks for having us today to talk about the Cherry Creek East design overlays. As Christine mentioned, I'm Libby Kaiser with Community Planning and Development. And there are 2 design overlays proposed in Cherry Creek East. The first is the street level and upper story setbacks with open space alternatives design overlay district, or DO9, which would apply to mixed use districts. And then there's the front porch and landscaping residential design overlay district, or DO10, that would apply to low scale residential districts. There are several properties that are within planned unit developments, or PUDs, in Cherry Creek East, and these would not be affected unless they were rezoned. And then because the overlays could be applied to other areas within the city, they've been given more descriptive titles rather than specifically referencing Cherry Creek East. And so here's the Cherry Creek East neighborhood kind of broadly outlined. And as Christine mentioned, Councilman Chris Hinds of Council District 10 submitted a proposal for a legislative rezoning to apply these new design overlay districts in this area. And the overlays are a result of a multi-year process led by the Cherry Creek East Association and kind of Bill Tanner at the helm of that. And with this text amendment, there's also a map amendment in this area to apply the overlays. And then just kind of as background, design overlays are tools the city uses to enhance design outcomes in a particular area by adding or modifying standards to the underlying zone districts. However, an overlay cannot be used to restrict or expand the uses that are allowed in the underlying district. And then Blueprint Denver says that design overlays can be appropriate in developing or redeveloping areas with a specific design vision, such as Cherry Creek East, where the Cherry Creek Area Plan of 2012 recommends tools such as upper story setbacks to allow sunlight to reach the street. Oh, going the wrong direction. Highlighted at the bottom of the screen is an excerpt from the Cherry Creek Area Plan that recommends exploring how upper story setbacks and other horizontal breaks in building facades can make streets more pedestrian friendly. So these overlays do stem from plan guidance. And then getting into the overlays themselves, kind of first off with the DO9, the intent of this overlay is to enhance and promote a quality urban environment with a vibrant sense of place, including access to generous pedestrian zones and public space with streets that prioritize the pedestrian realm is a defining element of neighborhood character, with buildings that relate to pedestrians in scale and activity. And the overlay would apply to residential mixed use and mixed use zone districts in Cherry Creek East. Here's a couple of existing commercial buildings in Cherry Creek East that lack upper story setbacks and don't have a great sense of pedestrian orientation. So to help achieve better design, the DO9 overlay includes several building form standards that would be applied in addition to the standards of the underlying zone district. The first requires the building frontage along a primary street to be within 5 to 15 feet of the lot line. And that can be reduced to 0 to 10 feet if private open space is provided. The building form standards also require 5-foot setbacks from primary and side streets, while a 0-foot setback is allowed if at least 7% of the zone lot contains private open space. Where structured parking is provided on lots, non-parking uses shall occupy the floor area above street level for a minimum depth of 15 feet for at least 70% of the frontage along primary and side streets. As an alternative to this requirement, structured parking facades must be integrated into the overall facade design through use of similar building materials and facade articulation and fenestration patterns, as well as non-transparent facade materials. The alternative also requires the parking floors be adaptable to other uses for a minimum depth of 30 feet from the primary or side street facing facades. The graphics here help show how the overlay could be applied.
I can't hear a thing.
Does anybody else have audio issues? Okay, thanks, Bill. So these graphics, like I said, show how the overlay could be applied. So the building on the left utilizes a 5-foot street level setback and upper story setbacks to improve the streetscape and reduce the building's mass. In lieu of these setbacks, the building on the right provides private open space on at least 10% of the lot. Finally, the building form standards in DO9 establish upper story setbacks to reduce the perceived mass and scale of buildings, preserve access to daylight, and promote creative building designs. On buildings greater than 6 stories, a 10-foot setback would be required above the 3rd story, while on buildings greater than 9 story, there's also a 15-foot setback that would be required above the 9th story. As an alternative to the setback above the 9th story, at least 3% of the lot could be provided as private open space at the ground level. And then moving on to the second overlay, the intent of the proposed DO10 overlay is to promote pedestrian-friendly street frontages and enhance neighborhood safety in portions of residential neighborhoods that are comprised primarily of single unit, 2-unit, and row house development. The only building form standard in this overlay relates to pedestrian access on the primary or side street and requires an unenclosed porch with a minimum depth of 6 feet and a minimum area of 48 feet. Front porches are already pretty prevalent in the neighborhood, and the standard is intended to continue this tradition. And then this overlay also includes some enhanced landscaping standards and requires a 60% of open areas be landscaped with live material, and then 40% with like non-live landscaping material. And it also requires 1 tree for each dwelling unit within the primary or side street setback or in the adjacent street right of way. And finally, the overlay requires 2 outdoor light fixtures for each dwelling unit intended to illuminate the primary or side street setback as well as the rear setback area. At this stage in the process, there is a public review draft that was released on September 8th and comments are due October 7th. So we would welcome any comments from this group until then. And then the planning board hearing is scheduled for November 2nd with the city council public hearing on January 9th. So that's all I have for you all. Thanks for allowing me to share this.
Thank you, Libby. A couple of things. I thought maybe we could hear from Bill Tanner, who's been involved. And then I'm wondering if you could put the map up while we chat, because I was wondering if Cherry Creek North, it looked like they're included, but I don't know. Bill, do you want to address this or?
Well, I can just talk to it briefly. It's first on the process, it comes out of a long process working with a couple of consultants that were funded by the city some years ago. And it really comes out of a discussion with members of the development committee and other members of the neighborhood about what they wanted out of the zoning overlay. Over the years, with a great deal of input from city planning, the overlay is sort of come out to what it is today, which should help with development, particularly on the commercial west side of Cherry Creek East. Our hope is that some of the ideas that are incorporated in the overlay can be used by other neighborhoods across the city. So there'll be a broader benefit than just to Cherry Creek East. I don't really know what else to say at this particular point in time. I just appreciate the time that Libby and Abe have put into this project, particularly showing up on weekends to present it, and in evenings, after work hours to continue to work on it. That's really above the call.
Okay, well, that's useful. I mean, it's great that the neighborhood has worked so hard on it. I do have, it doesn't look like Cherry Creek North is involved, but I do have a question on the naming of it, Libby. I know that when CPD did the Tennyson, I think it was the Tennyson overlays, they gave it a name that didn't have Tennyson in it, so it could be applied elsewhere. Are you doing that with this overlay?
We are, and that's kind of a trend with a lot of our overlays right now, is that we're trying to be less geographically specific and kind of just describing them for what they are, in case there's applicability elsewhere in the city where somebody might want to propose applying this. So that would be with either the DO9, kind of the more commercial mixed use overlay, or the residential one.
Okay, so the Cherry Creek East will drop out of the name at planning. And
yeah, it's currently not in the names,
Okay.
but it is just proposed right now for Cherry Creek East.
Okay, thank you. And I see a question from John O'Brien. Are there any considerations for water conservation in these overlays?
Not specifically, although the city does have like another kind of separate plan associated with sort of green building and sustainability that does address some water conservation principles.
So you're not going beyond the minimums that are established currently?
Not within these overlays. But like I said, there are other planning documents that propose water conservation.
I see Miles, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Libby, for presenting. Can we go back to, since you guys began the project, what was the reasoning? Why was the project created, and what was the expected outcome? What was the need for these changes?
And I'd actually ask Bill to address this, since he's been involved in this even longer than I have.
Sure, there was Cherry Creek East. There's been an enormous amount of development in Cherry Creek North. Okay, and as time passes and as Cherry Creek North becomes built up, developers have begun to view Cherry Creek East as rather attractive for development, and we've actually seen quite a bit of activity in the past year or two, which we expect to accelerate. So there was a desire on the part of the community to get ahead of that wave of development, to ensure that the development was such that there were benefits to the community as well as to the developers as that development took place. So the setbacks, for instance, are intended to allow more sunlight to reach the street than would otherwise be the case. So it's hard to see from the map here, but west of Madison Street, which sort of runs up and down about, yeah, that's about right, is really a heavily developed commercial area and will continue to be developed. As an example of the development in that area, you know, the Bro Company just wanted to develop the area at 50 South Steel, and they're changing that from 3 8-story buildings to 5 12-story buildings. Okay, with roughly 600 units in residence. Given the small size of the neighborhood, that's a pretty good increase in population, and a pretty good increase in density. There are also developments planned at 5 Cook Street, 3500 East Bayard, and other areas in Cherry Creek East to along Colorado Boulevard. So, you know, the hope is that we could get it ahead of this development and, you know, make sure that there was still some open space and that the walkability of the area, which is fairly high right now, was maintained and not lost to development. There's also Cavode, which is a 350 unit residential development in the center of the west part of Cherry Creek East, which is where I said the heavy development is taking place, or high density development is taking place. And that's a HUD supported home for you know, older people, okay, who live behind below general economic standards for Denver, and who are very, very old, most of them, you know, many in their 70s, 80s. And so the hope is to, and they tend to walk around a lot of neighborhood. That's their primary activity for staying healthy and staying fit. And so there was a concern that, you know, we wanted to maintain the walkability, particularly for that group of people in that area. So they would be able to get around in winter, spring, and summer and fall, and not be, you know, just shut in by high density development. So a lot of considerations are going on.
Okay, quick follow-up. So Libby, is most of the area now, I mean, if these pass, what will it impact? Because is it most of the area developed, or there's plans to develop it already? So how will this overlay impact any development?
So this overlay would be applied to any new redevelopments or any like rezonings of kind of these PUDs that are highlighted in gray on this map, which the commercial one, the D09 one that I discussed, would kind of mostly be like west of Madison, as Bill was saying. That's kind of the commercial core of Cherry Creek East, whereas the east side is more so row homes and other low scale residential development. So as these areas redevelop, the overlays would have to be applied to them. I know some of you have heard of a rezoning that's proposed for this corner southwest of Madison and Bayard. If that were to be approved by City Council on Monday, then that would be kind of one of the first developments that would be built utilizing these overlays. So there's opportunities for these to continue to shape development in the neighborhood.
Okay, so is there anything that you mentioned that they're looking at giving things for developers to not incentivize, I forget the word you used, but does the overlay give them anything, the developers, anything that zoning does not? Is there any benefit to development of the property that the overlay will impact?
There's not necessarily incentives to the developers, it's more so just kind of benefits to the community in shaping these buildings in a way that provides maybe some more ground floor open space, some relief, wider sidewalks, as well as the building kind of moves up vertically and has to step back its facade, it will increase kind of the sunlight that's allowed onto the street, as well as just shape the building in a more interesting manner than having it go straight up for 10 stories. And
Miles?
then with the residential side of it, making sure that there's kind of the porches, enhanced landscaping and lighting would also create a better pedestrian environment.
Miles, we've in talking to the developers as they begin their developments in the area, we asked them to include whatever goes into the overlay in their neighborhood agreement as part of their development plan. And we haven't really had any objections to that whatsoever. And the developers so far, including the ones at the intersection of Bayard and Madison, have now incorporated in their neighborhood agreement that they will follow whatever this zoning overlay includes. And that includes developments that took place before the overlay would take effect. In other words, they weren't required to do it. So it doesn't seem to be a significant burden on developers at all. And in the context of the neighborhood, being where it's located, most developers, I think, see the, they want a quality development here, to take place.
Well, that's good to hear. Just quickly, because I live in Congress Park, so I'm adjacent. You were mentioning you want to deploy this across the city. In what context, as a neighborhood living adjacent, and I know the city wants to change the zoning and has the right to change the zoning on like 12th Avenue, they can upzone properties in the future. What are your ideas on how they will deploy this overlay?
So this isn't necessarily like something that we would apply citywide, nor is it like a priority for us to apply this in other neighborhoods. But if there are other neighborhoods that were looking at our code and looked at the standards that were within these design overlays and said, hey, I think we could really benefit from applying these to our mixed use or residential areas, then that would be an initiative coming from a community that would want to apply these to their area.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm not seeing, there was a question on sidewalks, which Abe answered, thank you. And Brooks Waldman just made sure I understood that this starts below first. Thank you for that. So not seeing any other hands or any other questions. Thank you, Libby, for presenting. And thank you, Bill, for sticking with this for so many years. I know it's hard work, a lot of detail. So,
yeah.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Before I continue with the next presentation, I forgot to introduce myself and Ian is still on, I think. Ian Tafoya and myself, Christine O'Connor, are co-chairs currently of ZAP. And Ian, did you want to say anything before we go on to Abe? Guess not. Okay, so we had, many of you remember that last April we had Josh Palmieri talk about the ADU citywide project that was starting to be worked on by CPD, and it was fairly early in the process. We had seen a West Side overlay for ADUs. We had seen the District 5 and District 9 or 8 overlay for East Denver, East Colfax area, some bigger ADU steps, but this is different. This is rethinking ADUs on a citywide basis. It's a big project, and Josh presented, And we asked him to come back because right now they're apparently trying to wrap this up for early in the year and need recommendations. And before we get to Abe, though, is there anybody who's serving on the advisory committee of the ADU project in the room? I just want to recognize you and be able to ask you questions if you're here. No hands. Okay.
Oh, this is Gabriel Calder, and I'm also on the committee, but was representing Berkeley Regis United Neighbors RNO. So I'm part of the committee as well.
Okay, well, thank you for being here.
Yes,
You might
thank
be able to give some added insight. Okay, so Abe, do you have sharing capabilities? Abe Barge is working on this with Josh Palmieri. And Josh was going to come, but Abe is here instead, and Abe was going to speak anyway. So we're glad to have you, Abe. Thank you for showing up.
Hey,
Can you
thanks,
share?
Christine. Yeah, I think I should be able to. And Libby Kaiser is also working on this project. So thanks, Libby, and thanks, Gabe, for being here from the advisory committee. That's awesome. And so let me attempt to share. Sorry, it actually has been a little while for me in Zoom. Goes.
The green button at the bottom.
All right, are you seeing what a introductory screen?
Not yet.
Not yet. Oh, okay.
There we
Now
go.
you are?
Got it.
Awesome. So this presentation, it was probably just a little too long, so feel free to move me along, Christine, or stop, and we can have questions and then kind of zero in on the things that folks are most interested in. But just a reminder on the scope of the ADUs in Denver project, it's really about removing barriers to ADU construction and making sure they fit in with different types of neighborhoods and block patterns. So for example, making sure they fit in, on suburban lots without alleys, as well as on urban lots, which can be very different, and that might mean fairly different rules. So the project, what we expect the outcome to be is actually proposed revisions to the Denver zoning code. And the zoning code is where the rules are about the size, shape, and location of ADUs where they're allowed. So one confusing thing that's getting into the red text on the slide is that the project, this ADUs in Denver project, will not propose to rezone properties. So the distinction is that we will propose to update the zoning code, which will change the rules for building an ADU where ADUs are allowed. But we'll see a map in just a minute. ADUs are not allowed everywhere, and this project will not change that. So we're not saying that if you're in a zone district that doesn't allow ADUs now, that after this project, you would be able to build an ADU. But if you are in a zone district that allows ADUs, this project would change the rules about building one. And I think where it gets a little confusing is that outside of this project, as probably most of you know, there are separate efforts to rezone properties to allow ADUs. That Christine mentioned, for example, the council members, Councilman Sandoval has been most proactive, have proposed to rezone portions of their districts to allow ADUs. And there's a fairly big proposal right now for West Highland from Councilwoman Sandoval. And then individual property owners are also bringing their properties forward in some cases with proposals to rezone. So that's related to this project, but it's separate. Like this project is about the rules for building an ADU, not where you can build one. Does that help at all, Christine and others? You're muted still.
Yeah, I hear you. I just, when I look at all the changes that are being proposed or being discussed in your committee, I think, wow, those are big changes. So they will impact areas that currently don't feel the impact of ADUs.
There will be an impact for sure. And so in zone districts that allow ADUs, the proposal will include changes to the rules for them, which we can talk about. So don't want to minimize the fact that yes, it's it's a significant project. It's why we want to have really extensive conversations about it. It's very directly related to one particular adopted policy in Blueprint Denver, which basically says the same thing as our project objectives about removing barriers to constructing accessory dwelling units and creating context-sensitive form standards. Here's the map I was referring to. That this map of the city, the areas that are kind of that turquoise color, are the zone districts where you can build an accessory dwelling unit, an ADU now, and so. That includes, so any single unit zone district where the designation has a 1 at the end of it. So for example, SSUA1 is a district in which you can build ADUs, but single unit districts that don't have that are not colored in here because you can't build ADUs, and this project won't change that. So SSUA, no 1 at the end, can't build an ADU. And then the other thing you're seeing on this map are where we've actually permitted ADUs in the last 11 to 12 years, is really starting in 2010 when the current set of rules came into place. And so you see there's definitely certain concentrations. It's good. Glad that Gabe is here. Like the Berkeley neighborhood is definitely one of the concentrations in the northwest part of Denver, and Curtis Park, Baker. Then there are some areas of the city where ADUs are permitted, where there's not very many. In some cases, like you'll see East Colfax on the east side of the map. That was actually, the neighborhood was just rezoned by a proposal from Councilwoman Sawyer and Herndon. And so the ability to build ADUs has existed for less than a year there, which is one of the reasons why you'd see fewer permitted ADUs. And so then just that chart on the left, just indicating that all those dots together, that's 415 ADUs over that time period. And so that may sound like a lot, but I think in the end, that means like there's the average block does not have an ADU on it. And if ADUs continue to be built at this rate, that will stay true for quite some time. So, and just another interesting piece of information, you probably know that our zone districts in the 2010 code kind of grouped in these context categories, suburban neighborhood context, for example, urban neighborhood context, urban edge neighborhood context. So urban neighborhood context are neighborhoods, closer in towards downtown, includes Congress Park, actually includes Wash Park, Baker. Those zone districts are where most of those dots are, as you saw on the map. So 77% of all the ADU permits have been in urban neighborhood context zone districts. So getting to
Abe, there's a question. Can you clarify, and I don't know if it's for now or later, the difference between DADUs and ADUs that are within the primary structure? And if this isn't the right place, just maybe you can incorporate it.
No, that's great. And I'm glad you brought that up. And please, if you see other things in the chat, because my unsophisticated, oh, wait, okay. Here, I just figured out how to open the chat and see it at the same time as the presentation. So yeah, the DADU, that's just like an acronym for detached accessory dwelling unit. And so that's like an accessory dwelling unit can be attached or detached. And when we say ADU, we mean both. And so the attached ADU would be, it's in the primary structure. So that's like a basement apartment, or a dwelling unit that's like anywhere just inside your house. Then a detached accessory dwelling unit is what most people want to talk about, and what we've mostly talked about in this project are the separate accessory structures that have an ADU in them. And so that's like an alley house or a cottage, or, you know, the sort of alley flat. There's lots of different names people give them. And just want to be clear that in the zoning code now, and so far I haven't like heard any discussion in the project about changing this, when you can build an ADU, like you're in one of the zone districts that allows ADUs, one of the turquoise areas, you could do either one, attached or detached. And when you do attached, the rules about the form of the ADU like are just the same rules about your house. Like it just has to fit within those same rules. When you do detached, there are special rules for it. And that's what a lot of the conversation in the project has been about, what those special rules should be. So the process for the project, we've been moving through a series of stages from, you know, kicking off early this year through an exploration of all the issues that relate to those project objectives, then looking at what are some alternate ways to address those issues, onto, based on that, what should the strategy really be? Then we go into developing the tools, which basically means writing a proposal for amending the zoning code, and then an adoption process. As you can see, the little square here is kind of indicating where we're intended to be in the process, which is kind of somewhere between evaluating the alternatives and recommending a strategy. We actually, talk about this more in a second, are wanting to make a little bit more time here right now based on what we're hearing about certain things. And so we think we're not actually going to be ready to say, here's the recommended strategy until November at this point, and are going to just keep on talking about the alternatives until then. And of course, anywhere along the way, right up until you know, the zoning changes are considered by City Council, which would be, you know, potentially in March of next year, you know, we're interested in hearing your feedback. And there've been quite a few opportunities for that. Just a list of some of the events we've had and groups we've spoken to here. The green things are things that are scheduled but haven't happened yet. And I just want to mention, you know, we just had a kind of in-person and online public open house, starting with an in-person open house that was on August 25th. And you'll see some pictures of Libby there in a minute, because she's actually working on this project too. And you know, it was like a really great event. We had over 100 people register. I think fewer than that actually attended, but over the course of a few hours, residents came in, reviewed a whole series of presentation boards about the issues that we've been discussing and some ideas to address them. There was a worksheet that they could fill out with a number of questions related to the boards. And then we, you know, the day after that in-person open house, we put all of that on the ADUs in Denver website as basically an online survey, like all those same questions. And then we just finished up that online survey on September 16th. And I think it's going to take us another week or two to like compile all the results from all of that, because we really want to look at like how the results varied from people responding in different neighborhoods and that kind of thing, just to give folks, you know, the idea of what we're hearing. Like overall, like we've heard a lot of positive feedback, but not all positive, and we want to address that.
Excuse me, Abe.
Yeah.
Did you send invites to all the RNOs to distribute that survey? Number one, and two, on the previous survey in May, it says you only had 377 responses. We can't see that on the website, what the responses were.
We're going to publish like pretty soon here, like within a week or two, a whole accounting of all the feedback that we've heard, including like every response from that survey and then every response from this second survey as well. Both surveys, our communications folks sent out a notice to all RNOs beforehand about the upcoming events.
Okay. Thank you.
The second, the one that recently closed, we had about 500 responses, so it did just a little bit better. And so just to note, like if you go to adusindenver.com or just navigate through community planning and development to zoning code text amendments to here, there's a whole series of resources. You can sign up to get notice of things. You can sign up if you want to be involved in like specific groups about the project. If you want us to come speak to your group, you can sign up for that. There's like lots of material from all the past meetings that we've had, agendas, presentations, summaries, and there's a couple of reports, just background for the project, like what are the rules for ADUs now, etc. And then a report on the issues that were identified. So, and as I mentioned, the originally we had thought we would be getting to the recommended strategy right about now, but just based on our advisory committee discussion and some of the things we're hearing, we want to take a little bit longer right now before we do that. Like I said, like a lot of the questions that we've asked about issues and potential solutions, we're getting pretty positive responses about the ideas that have come out of the advisory committee discussion. But there's some areas in particular where we want to have more discussion. The rules that could apply in suburban neighborhoods, if there were rezonings to allow ADUs there, are one of them, particularly the height of ADUs and their setbacks from neighboring properties. Another one is just like looking more closely at the relationship between the size of a detached ADU and the primary structure. Owner occupancy is kind of a technical thing. Talk about if you have questions, we need to talk about that more. And we just continue to hear about, can't we come up with more nuanced ways to make sure privacy is protected as ADUs are built? The issues that we've heard about, I kind of put them in these 4 categories, which really is just overall, some of the issues relate to ADUs fitting in with different neighborhoods. And then some of them relate to the fact that our current rules and process may increase their cost or make them hard to build, which is another thing we're looking at as part of this project. And then here, this big overwhelming chart is really just indicating, on the left side there, that column starting with minimum lot size for detached accessory dwelling units. Those are like the issues that have really risen to the top of the list as the biggest issues. And then you can kind of see those categories of issues across the top, like impacts on neighborhoods and community. Most of these issues really fit in more than one category. Well, all of them do. And, also, like one thing that's been really important to acknowledge, is it's been a big part of the discussion, is that the issues are experienced differently in different kinds of neighborhoods across the city. And we're having a lot of discussion about how the potential solutions could vary as well. Looking here, like this is just, there's lots more distinctions between neighborhoods than this, but those kind of neighborhood contexts that I talked about before, from urban edge, suburban, clearly you see here, like the existing built environment does tend to be really different. But even within like an urban neighborhood, you'll see that kind of upper left graphic. It's sort of a classic Denver Square type urban neighborhood, but there's places that are much lower scale than that and have more bungalows. And then what you're seeing in these graphics is just those kind of colored in buildings are detached accessory dwelling units. So you can kind of see, like, obviously the the existing characteristics of the neighborhood might make a really big difference in terms of how you reacted to a new ADU. For example, in this urban, I don't know if you can see where I'm pointing, but when you kind of look from a bird's eye view, you can see that we've kind of built several hypothetical detached ADUs in that neighborhood. When you're actually looking at the street view, in a lot of cases, they're pretty hard to see because of the existing, most of the houses are 2-story. So right back behind that middle Denver Square type house, there actually is an ADU that you can barely see. But in Urban Edge, where this, this sample neighborhood where the scale is much lower, an ADU, even if it wasn't on the corner like this, is probably going to be easier to see from the street. And that really makes a difference in terms of how you relate to it, I think. Just take a pause. We're kind of almost out of the main slides here, but what I was planning to do just with the remaining slides is actually to zero in on just a few of the sample issues and actually talk about some of the solutions that that the committee has been talking about. It would take way too long to go through all of them, but let me know, Christine, if you want to pause here or if you want me to plow forward.
Well, how many slides do you have left? How many examples of these?
Let's see,
issues? Because-
about 4.
Okay, because I would be curious to hear what are the main concerns that residents have brought up, not developers. And I'd like to hear some of those and some of the solutions that you're still discussing. But why don't, if you just have 4, I think that's good. And then we can start getting questions.
Okay, sounds great. So one of them is the minimum lot size for detached ADUs. This is a rule that applies only to detached ADUs, not to attached. So in a zone district where you can build them now, there are minimum lot sizes that say you must have at least this big a lot or you just can't do a detached ADU. So that's come up as an issue, it means that even in zone districts where you can build ADUs, there's lots of lots that could never have one. That's felt kind of unfair to some folks. One example is in Sloan Lake, which within the last couple of years was rezoned to allow ADUs by Councilwoman Sandoval. The map on the right-hand side of this slide, you're seeing all of the lots that are zoned to allow ADUs that are actually too small to permit one. And that's actually 30% of all the lots that are in Sloan Lake are in that category. So the potential solution here, and this is one where, at least so far, like we're hearing pretty positive things about it, is to simply remove the minimum lot size requirements. There are a lot of other rules about ADU setbacks, a bulk plane rule that means that affects the height of the ADU the closer you get to your neighbor, that would all remain in place. And on the smallest lots, there are still for sure going to be challenges with figuring out how to meet all those rules on the small lot. But the discussion right now is remove the rule that says you just literally cannot have one on a smaller lot. So, and then Gertie asks if the zone lot is too small for a detached ADU, can they rezone from to a different zone district that has a different minimum lot size that's smaller? The answer is, well, you can, as a property owner, propose any rezoning. However, the way that the criteria for considering rezoning works, if you're in a zone district where there isn't a pattern of lots that's kind of like yours and is really small, like all the other lots are small or something like that, maybe it's going to meet the criteria for rezoning. But if not, you're probably going to have a hard time fixing this situation for yourself by rezoning your property. One reason is that by rezoning to a different zone district entirely, that would open up some other possibilities besides just building an ADU, like splitting your lot into 2 lots and things like that. And we're not contemplating like that as part of this project. So in order to just kind of simplify things and streamline things for everyone, it seems like, the discussion is really pointing towards just remove the minimum lot size standard, then you're not forced to try to rezone, which might not even work anyway. So another one is the maximum square footage of an accessory dwelling unit, whether attached or detached. The code currently varies the maximum by the size of your lot. And on smaller lot sizes says that the maximum is 650 square feet for an accessory dwelling unit. And so we've heard that, that's definitely on the small end for anyone except like a single person, basically. Like you definitely too small for, even a small family. That also by limiting the size so much, we might be encouraging use of the ADU just as a short-term rental, for example, because it's less workable as a long-term rental. And so the solution that's been discussed so far is actually just to remove that lowest limitation, which would limit you to 650 square feet. And instead, even on the smaller lot size categories, allow 864 square feet, which probably sounds like kind of a funny number that just kind of comes out of what you would probably be able to build under all of the other standards anyway. And so this would make it a little bit easier to build an ADU that might be workable for a wider variety of people in more places. And getting close to the end here, here's one where we definitely need more conversation. So the overall maximum height of a detached accessory dwelling unit. One of the things we've talked about a lot is that everywhere where you can build an ADU now, for a detached ADU, the limit in height in stories is 1.5 stories, which is confusing to everyone, including planners. It technically means that the second floor can't be as big as the first floor, and it can only be 75%. It's not half, it's 75% of the first floor. And so that image in the upper right, you see that basically, that the second floor is smaller than the first floor. And that's been built that way in order to meet that current rule. But we've heard a lot about how, we have other rules already that mean that you can't build, 2 stories right near your setback. That's the bulk plane does that. Why, especially if you had a bigger lot, do you have to do this funny building form, which might increase, probably would increase the cost of building and might kind of create strange incentives, like building a bigger ground floor just so that you could get enough livable square footage on the upper floor, for example. So for that, what's been discussed is saying that the 1.5 story limit wouldn't be there. You could just build 2 stories, but we wouldn't change the maximum height in feet, which is 24 feet. So that wouldn't change. Just the rule that says you have to build this kind of funny shape, like in the upper right, would change. The thing we need to talk about more with that, I think, is whether that applies everywhere where ADUs are allowed. And it probably almost for sure wouldn't apply in suburban neighborhoods, where the discussion so far has kind of said, like, if and when ADUs are allowed in suburban neighborhoods because there are rezonings, that the limit should actually just be 1 story and a lower height in feet. So we need to talk about both of those things more, because I think, like, For outside of suburban neighborhoods, the idea that you could build a full 2-story, there's some concern about that always being okay. And then in suburban, kind of on the flip side is, have we gone too far? And is it just too limiting to say in every situation, if you're in a suburban district, you can only build 1 story? So we're going to be talking about those more. Here's just another kind of example of what that 1.5 story thing does, is that sometimes it means that when you're following all the other rules about what you could build for the ground floor size, that 75% second floor actually is really small. Like you've kind of been backed into a corner by that rule. And so we managed to get there. But I'm sure you have questions.
Great. Of course I do, but I'm going to see if anybody else does first. I don't see any hands up, but I'm sure maybe Gabriel has something to add, or anybody else who's been attending the meetings has something to add. I didn't hear you talk about the, 2 participants raised hand. Hold on. Okay, I don't see who it is, but somebody start. Do you want to take the screen down? Maybe.
I see Gabe and Robert, and I will stop sharing as well.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Gabe and then Robert.
Oh, okay. Just one thing that I had to elaborate on is, Abe, maybe you could mention that you've also done some studies from other cities, just to, kind of compare what's going on with Denver versus like Portland. People were thinking, if we changed the owner occupancy rule, that all these investors were going to come in, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So maybe just say, a little bit on the case studies that the committee's done.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a great point. We've been talking to other cities, and there are some cities that have been talking about this a lot longer than we have. Gabe mentioned Portland is one of them. They've kind of gone through this series of stages over more than 15 years now, where they first allowed them with lots of rules, then allowed them in more places with fewer rules, and then most recently have allowed them everywhere with a relatively flexible set of rules. So one of the things we really wanted to talk with them about specifically was, like, as they move through that series of changes, like what happened with, like, was there suddenly just a giant boom with ADUs everywhere? The answer is no. Naturally, the number of ADUs being built did go up over that time as you were able to build them in more places in Portland under more flexible rules. But it stayed at a pretty modest rate. Like, ADUs are built probably about twice as often in Portland as they are here. And then Gabe mentioned one specific rule, which is something we're going to be talking about more, is right now in our zoning code, in the use limitations for an accessory dwelling unit use, this is kind of buried in Article 11 of the zoning code. It says what you have to do when you're establishing an ADU use on your property. It says that in a single unit district that allows ADUs, the owner of the property has to live there in order for the use to be allowed, which you can see why that rule would have been put in place, I think, like just concern about, there being like an owner there to take responsibility, and maybe some concern about changes in the neighborhood if there was somebody renting the main house and the ADU. The rule, though, certainly as it's written now, is pretty restrictive, because what it means is that you add an ADU to your property, you live there, everything's good, it's allowed in the zone district. But let's say you want to move across the street in with your partner or something like that. You technically now, that ADU that you built isn't allowed anymore because you, the owner, don't live there anymore. So the only solutions would be sell the property to somebody else who will agree to live there, or disable the ADU. That basically means like if you had a tenant there, they would get displaced and you'd have to like take out the kitchen or, you know, do something so that there was no longer a dwelling unit there. So, you know, clearly, you know, that's come up as an issue. And what we've heard from Portland and other cities that used to have a rule like that and removed it is that it actually just made life easier, but didn't really change much about the way ADUs were built. Like, for example, Gabe mentioned the fear that if we didn't have that rule, an investor could just come in, buy a property, build an ADU, turn around and rent them both out, turn around and sell them, like that it would basically just be an avenue for like property speculation. What we've heard from other cities is that that generally just doesn't happen, that ADUs are not really, if all you're trying to do is make a buck off your property, tend not to be that top investment. And so in Portland, they don't get builders coming in and buying up a lot of properties and building ADUs. It's homeowners that are building them. In some cases, those homeowners don't live there anymore because they don't have to, but they were built by homeowners in the first place rather than by developers or real estate investors. Sorry, very long-winded answer to your question, Gabe. It was a good question.
Thanks, Abe. I think I have this order: Miles, and then Bill, then Robert Schmidt. Okay, so Miles.
Yeah, thanks, Abe, I know you presented this before, but I've got a couple of questions. As you mentioned, you're working on this because this was mentioned by Blueprint Denver to remove all barriers to ADUs. Well, Blueprint Denver also says that all single-family lots should be rezoned to duplex, triplex, and quadplex. So I'm expecting you guys to push that at some point in the future. And how would that impact? So let's say you allow this to go through and people can build an ADU. So in the future, does the planning goes, okay, so you can build 3 units on a single family. So how does the ADU and 3 future single family residences, how do they impact each other?
Yeah, good question, Miles. And so what Blueprint says, it doesn't say you should be able to build like that there should be no barriers to building an ADU, because I think that would mean there couldn't really be any rules. It just says we, should be like streamlining things as much as possible. And it also doesn't say there should be no single unit zoning. It just talks about the need to explore the opportunity for more housing options, which, we have to figure out what the distinction is.
Let me correct you there, because when I've read it, because we went through East Central, it says this will happen. So it's and you don't see that language in these plans very often, but it says this will happen. Same thing with alternate housing, and these things have happened and you've moved forward with those. So anyways, just
yeah, I'll try to call up that Blueprint policy so we can look at it. But in any case, it does say that we should be looking at housing in lower scale residential neighborhoods more generally. And we had started to think about a project that would take that on, like the bigger picture, a couple years ago, and we hit pause on that. It just clearly, there were so many planning conversations going on at the same time, and I think it was pretty overwhelming for the public and for city council to like think about such a big project. And then as we paused that, we also just looked at, okay, are there things that we could more reasonably do that relate to these objectives? And that's where this ADUs in Denver project came in, is that it's just kind of one much smaller part of the scope of that, is like, let's just look at the barriers to building ADUs and making sure that the rules are sensitive to different kinds of neighborhoods. So that's what we're doing in this project. Now, if we were to take on the bigger project again at some point. Blueprint directs us to, but we don't specifically have any timeline on that. We'd have to figure out how to integrate whatever comes out of this project with that, which is something that like Portland had to do, for example, because they had already had this whole system for allowing ADUs and they were allowed everywhere. And then they took on this big project, which was about like, what about other housing? And they kind of had to figure it all out. So then that would mean like, you know, so there's no really way to know the outcome of that. Like maybe you really still could only build one ADU on a lot, or maybe not. That would all be part of some future conversation.
So you're not sure. So I guess just getting back to, so if at a future time this came up in planning committee about, I think some of this again, breaking up single family lots. And the planning board basically said, you guys should look at everything and even make the lots smaller. So I guess what that leads me to think is you're allowing ADUs now, you'd like it to be raised to about 864 square feet. I live in a Denver square and that's about the square footage of my house. And you just want to allow that to be built on any lot, any size as a minimum. So what is to prevent somebody from basically building a second residential unit for an 864 square foot ADU? And then at some point splitting the property, if you guys allow that, and then just selling the houses, because you could make a huge amount of profit by subdividing a lot and having 2 residential houses on it.
Yeah, so we don't actually in single unit zone districts, you couldn't do that lot split. You are correct that as far as the conversation has gone so far, if you were in a zone district that allowed ADUs, and even if you had a pretty small primary residence on the house, you could still build, you know, up to an 864 square foot ADU on the lot. I mentioned that this is something that we want to have more discussion about because, you know, naturally there is some tension about this idea that the ADU could ever be bigger than the primary house. But also part of that conversation is the fact that the current rules, if you were to add on to the primary house or build a new one, would allow you to build a much bigger primary house than an ADU. So is the accessory to what's there now, or is the accessory to what could be, is one question. And then just, you know, some cities do have rules that say that the ADU size is directly related to the size of the primary structure. So like if you have a small house, then the ADU has to be even smaller. But we've also heard like that can really be kind of unfair, because it's saying like if you already have a big house, you get a big ADU, but if you don't, then you don't, or it can encourage you to build a bigger house just so you can build a bigger ADU and those kinds of things. So these are just all the things we need to balance in the conversation.
But you see the concerns here. If the move for the city is to allow lots to be subdivided and allow multiple units on single lots, then it's a very easy leap to say, well, we can just sell the ADUs as separate entities and break the lots up. And then we could get more housing because we would get more development in Denver because somebody could buy a house and build an ADU and then sell it for $800,000.
Yeah, so just want to clarify that anything about splitting lots that's not part of the ADUs in Denver project, like we won't propose any changes there. Yeah, you may have heard planning board members or others talking about a desire to enable those kinds of things in the future, but that would all be part of some future conversation. Like we're not going to.
But it could happen, I the is my point. The city
Zoning
would
can
propose
change
that.
over time. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Portland does that, by the way, Abe.
Yeah.
Portland allows you to split your lot with your ADU, so it isn't that far-fetched. Bill, do you want to go?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I wrote a note. I'm a big supporter of ADUs and the ADU project and working out how best to integrate them into Denver in an effective way. I guess the one question is, what thought have you given to the life stage needs of people who may benefit from ADUs and removing barriers to those stages? Most notably, I'm thinking, mostly of elderly people right now being able to have nursing aides or various other support living in their property, maybe on a free or adjusted rent basis, and eliminating barriers to make a portion of their house a living unit for those support people.
Yeah, great comment. And so yes, we've heard a lot about like how great it can be for ADUs to provide a way for like a resident to kind of stay in the neighborhood as they move through the life cycle, or bring in elderly relatives, or even house adult children. And as far as like specifically promoting the kind of life cycle use and removing barriers, it's mostly come down to like specific things. And one of them is that square footage limit that we talked about, that, if you limit it to 650 square feet, that might be so limiting that it's just not very workable for you to relocate yourself into the ADU as you age and rent out your primary structure. And then also that some of the rules, including that 1.5 story height limitation, can really affect your ability to build like accessibility features, ramps or elevators, because they technically take up area that's considered habitable square footage. And that ends up being really, really limited on the second story. And, we have a committee member who actually got a zoning denial on an ADU that he was building, I think for his mother who had accessibility needs. And then, had a tough time with the zoning variance there. So that's just an example of like, if we can remove like what look like unnecessary rules to really enable those things to happen, we'd like to propose that.
And then one other second brief question is keying off sort of what Miles was talking about. I'm a little wary now, having worked in the development area in my own neighborhood, about setting up perverse incentives for developers to just make more money off of whatever changes we make to zoning. I don't mean to say that is always unacceptable or not acceptable, but my thought is that if we allow something like ADUs and you don't have to live on the property, and a developer say builds 2 units where one was permitted before, and therefore now can make considerably more money than they could make before. And their sole goal is to flip the property, not to live in it, not to develop it, or not to improve it. How do we manage those incentives so that the city in some ways, or the neighborhood in some ways, benefits at the same time that the developer benefits, or developer makes incremental funds off of this? I'm not opposed to developers making incremental money, by the way, but if I were thinking of it, I would say, oh, great, I can build 3 units on a property that was originally zoned for 1, and resell it for a terrific gain. Now there is some benefit to the community in that now more people can live on that land. Okay, we've created more density, but what other benefits ought to be gained by the community or the neighborhood for that incremental gain and profitability that the developer got? So we're just not handing people, through zoning, huge increments and value. I mean, I can just see out of state developers saying, "Oh, this is great. We're going to come into Denver and start building ADUs on properties and flipping them because we had that may have some benefits, but it also comes with some costs. And then how do we manage the cost side of it?
Yeah, that was well put. That sure, there could be benefits. We do need housing. Any of the neighborhoods where ADUs are allowed are great places to live, and whoever builds an ADU, they are adding housing options. But you totally understand the concern about like there just being like a lot of change through redevelopment, but we really just haven't, like from talking to cities that just don't have the owner occupancy rule in place that we have. They say basically, because it still tends to cost an average of around $300,000 to build an ADU, that it really isn't a value proposition to take a property where you can build 2 units now, add that ADU, and then turn it around and just rent both units, that there's just other opportunities that are more profitable to them. And so, like what Portland sees is that, 95+% of ADUs are built by the people that live on the properties, because they don't have, their motives are not 100% economic. They're thinking about elderly relatives. They're just thinking about their own long-term needs.
Okay, let's continue with Robert.
Hi. Abe, thanks very much for coming and making a presentation today for this. I see that there's other people with their hands up and in the queue, so I have a page and a half of comments here that were forwarded to you and Josh about a week and a half or so ago. This is an assessment report that's been prepared for Brunn Zoning and Planning Committee for consideration and potential action going up to the Brunn board. So you may see a number of these points formally coming through as questions / considerations from our RNO on this topic. I just want to touch on a couple of things that have been generally discussed already here. The first one is looking at neighborhood impacts, prioritization, and equity, which kind of combines a couple of the points in our assessment report. There's been a lot of discussion over the 6 advisory committee meetings and documentation that has come out from that of prioritizing the relaxing or simplification of rules of engagement for developing ADUs. And the discussion has taken a path in the sense that impacts to adjoining neighbors have become secondary. They're talked about, but in the language, it appears that it's become secondary. If the outcome of the ADU project is to be fully equitable throughout the city, then what we are considering for recommendation, as I've said in the report, is that there needs to be a formal codified mechanism within the code to evaluate adjoining neighbor conditions and evaluate impacts on those adjoining neighbors, and have that done at the time of the zoning review and not wait until it gets into construction documents in a building code type situation. Second major point, which has been discussed here today, has been the owner occupancy rule within the code. The first thing with regards to this discussion so far is that Denver is not Portland. The real estate market is very dynamic and things will change. And we've seen that with the unintended consequences of the 2010 code producing the slot home condition that ended up having to be corrected. And so what the outcome of this exercise in the ADU project should be looking at things more strategically rather than tactically, and should anticipate that at some time market forces will change, some way, shape, or form, and that multiple properties on any one given block will have ADUs. Granted that this project does not address the two biggest components in the ADU development question, and that is overall construction costs and the capacity of the design and construction community to be able to produce X amount of units in any given year. And so generally right now, your comments on we're not going to be seeing much more than the type of development numbers that we've seen in the past. And that will probably be true. But we have to look at constructing code language to, in a sense, take into account worst case scenarios and what may happen in a dynamic market that may change over time. One of the biggest trends in national residential real estate is the introduction of institutional investors into single-family residential neighborhoods, buying up properties and turning around and renting them. This is different than a developer building and selling and flipping or whatever, because these institutional developers are buying and holding. The elimination of the owner occupancy rule will have the unintended consequence. It's my belief that this will introduce this component into residential neighborhoods in greater and greater numbers as time goes on, because of the general economic climate in this country and the disparity of wages and people being able to afford housing and all of those type of situations. So the recommendation to be considered is that the owner occupancy rule not be eliminated from the code language. Like I said, I'm not going to take up a lot of time going through the rest of this entire page of issues. They're here. If INC ZAP wants to incorporate this assessment report in some way in its committee deliberations and discussions with INC board, that's fine. I'm here to assist in that effort. But just here for the record, I hope that you would read through this assessment report, take these considerations seriously, because it was mentioned in meeting number 6 that there are people in the community that do have an opinion that programs that come out of the city are basically almost already totally cooked before they reach the public realm. There needs to be a full consideration and full equity of all of these issues if we, as a community, are to counter that belief in the community, and that the planning department is actually taking into account everybody's considerations and their views in looking at any one particular topic. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Robert.
Robert,
And,
would you like to share that with the group in some way?
Share what?
Your
Yes.
assessment?
Well, the assessment report, basically, I didn't do it on letterhead. It's because we don't have letterhead in our group. It's basically that detailed email that I sent you. And it would be the revised copy, because there was a document produced by the ADU project in August that is available on the website that actually answered some of our questions in a couple of instances. And there were some slight revisions to the original one that I sent. So you look for the email that has revised on it.
Yeah, I'm just asking if you have some way to share with the people here today who might be interested. So just think about how that could be done.
I don't know how I could get that to people who are online here today. I'm not that good at Zoom. I'm with Abe here. I'm like not a really Zoom person. Other than like, hi, I'm here. But if there was, I don't know how I could put that document in the chat.
I don't either. I'm just asking you to think about if you can, but I hear you, and I thank you for your thoughtful work on this. I know you're not on the committee, but it's pretty important. We just got a report from web on the group living, and they still don't have statistics on whether it's really increased housing availability or whether, and as Abe said, the ADUs are a tiny fraction, and it's really frustrating to see the
Yeah,
city have so much energy on this.
Yeah,
when
it
it's
was
rebuilding.
really revealing and interesting in meeting 6 when they put the map up. Abe showed this at the beginning of the presentation, where it has the little dots all over town. And you have to take into account that those 410 units have been developed over a 10-year period.
Yeah.
So yes, objectively speaking, it's not like these recommendations would go through the meat grinder and come out the other end next spring as an adopted text amendment. And all of a sudden, Abe would be flooded with 410 people at his office the next day with little sketches in their hands. It's probably not going to be, but that at the same time doesn't mean that we need to not seriously consider what the worst case scenarios were going to be, because the slot home is definitely an example of what will happen when we don't think holistically on these matters. If someone on the call here today is interested in seeing a copy of this assessment report, they can email me at rcsdesign@me.com.
Okay, thanks, Robert. Put that in the chat.
Will do.
Let's
and
go to
just wanted
Katie.
just to acknowledge Robert, like, yeah, absolutely. Like, we, our best guess based on what's happened so far and what's happened in other cities is, that things change slowly. But you're absolutely right that we don't know for sure what future market conditions would bring. And so we do want to get the rules right. We don't want to just rely on the fact that there probably won't be that many ADUs. We want the rules to be right in case there are a lot of ADUs, which could really bring some benefits if there were.
Okay, so we've got Katie, John, and Gertie, and then I'm going to ask Bruce to speak, or I'll try to read his question. But Katie?
Hi, this is Katie Fisher, and I'm over by the University of Denver. So we have within a block of my house, 2 blocks of my house, at least 6 to 8 ADUs that are grandfathered in. And my point is not one of them is owner occupied. That it just doesn't happen. People don't stay in the same structure their entire livelihood, even though if we think we're going to bring in our elderly and they're going to remain in the house to the day they die. No, usually they need to go off to assisted living or something else along that ways. And the family changes. And around us, we find all these old ADUs. So this is Denver. They all turn into rentals. It is never upkept. That is one of the problems is if somebody, I'm sorry about the phone. If somebody, Steve, can you grab the phone and take it in the other room? Go answer it. And so I apologize. So what happened is they are not upkept. These converted garages, which would be a detached unit, they all look awful. Money is put it into the main house, but not to the detached. The ones that converted their basements into another unit, once again, upstairs may get a new kitchen, but the basement one doesn't. So the property value and the neighborhood value, yeah, we have a lot of low income people who are able to find housing, but it's substandard. So to think that somebody is going to invest a lot of money and make these beautiful ADUs, some parts of the city, I think it would work. But here, we're a living example of 20 years later, they're junk. It's just junk. So just to let you know, Portland might be doing fine, but Denver has a history of needing housing, but somebody goes cheap and it never keeps up the neighborhood. That's my point.
Thanks, Katie.
Thanks, Katie. John Ferguson.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity. I was really struck, Abe, when you said that the money proposition of building an ADU in order to provide an income, in order to make money, just didn't make sense, that the cost of ADUs is too high. And in that context, I want to ask a question. In our neighborhood by West Washington Park, there's a lot of conversation about the idea that ADUs can provide a way to provide lower income housing and do something to help satisfy or ameliorate the housing crisis we're having in Denver. That comment seems to make that be not true, that the value of the ADU rules and the ability to build one is a private benefit to a person who lives in the house and has some private family issue that they want to solve by having an ADU. But it's not a way to really provide housing. And then Katie spoke up and I went, oh my God, she's right. There are little abandoned ADUs, apartments in old buildings around my neighborhood that were built back during the Second World War, I think, to provide housing, and nobody's using them now. So I'm wondering why we're doing this big effort for ADUs. What is the overall purpose and goal of really making it a whole lot easier to have ADUs in Denver? Thanks.
Thanks, John. And yeah, just want to definitely emphasize that this effort about ADUs is not the solution to the housing crisis in Denver or nationwide. There's going to have to be a lot of different solutions. It's going to be very difficult to solve completely. We've got a whole series of different initiatives related to it. A really big one was the expanding housing affordability project. Those changes were adopted by City Council in July, creating greater affordability requirements for new development. So for this project, in the multi-year Blueprint Denver process, there really was just a lot of talk about all of the different ways in which we needed to address the housing question. And ADUs are just one part of that as a way for there to be relatively lower impact, ideally addition of housing to existing neighborhoods. Oftentimes they're single unit neighborhoods that, there's certainly a desire that that housing help with affordability, but that's a difficult thing to tackle because, in a big project, you can require some of the units to be dedicated as affordable. Like there's literally a covenant on the property that says what the rents can be or the sale prices can be. That's what came out of the expanding housing affordability project. That likely can't really make sense with an accessory dwelling unit because it just would remove all incentive to build one if you were going to be so restricted in its use. So we're looking at it more of like, it's a housing option. True, like, if you're like, have a really low income, it may still be quite difficult to afford one, even though the ADU is likely to be one of the less expensive things in any given neighborhood. It may still be too expensive. But, there's people looking for housing in a whole variety of income groups. And, I think it's kind of about that as well. And I also think like, while yes, it costs so much to build one, that it's kind of difficult to then just turn around and rent it out to somebody really affordably. Actually, what Katie brought up is interesting that like over time though, that can kind of change. And you see that in Denver's urban neighborhoods, that there's lots of housing that was built a long time ago that just isn't necessarily like the latest greatest, and it's relatively more affordable just at market rates. And so I think that just kind of indicates that providing more different kinds of housing over time is really something that can help make sure people can find the housing that they're looking for. That's a really just in the very long term.
Okay, thanks, Abe and John. Gertie?
Yeah, thank you, Abe, and all the rest of you who have participated in this process. Abe, my question is something on a sort of different area. I, like John Ferguson, am in a neighborhood where there has been discussions about ADUs, and my question relates, it is a neighborhood that is zoned, the area I'm thinking about is zoned primarily single unit, and most of the lots, although not all, are B size, so that they're 37, they're a city and a half lot. If somebody builds a new garage in the rear of one of those lots, they can go all the way out to the zone, the side zone lot on either side for that garage. But if they want to put an ADU on top of that garage, the side setbacks bring the whole structure in 5 feet on both sides. My question is, has there been any consideration about, in order to incentivize, and I realize this is not the city's priority, but in reality, it is something that people in our neighborhood need, partly for crime, but also because there are off-street parking issues, or there are parking problems in our neighborhood. Letting the garage, the first story, go out to the zone lot line and bring the second story in 5 feet on each side of the structure on the second story, in order to allow more sunlight to get into both that backyard and the neighbor's backyard.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense to me. It's great that you're jumping into these technical details, and we've definitely been talking about these with the committee. And so one of the things Gertie is referring to is that there's a current rule that this is actually not true of just about any other kind of construction, but with a detached ADU, in order to establish the ADU use, it can only be in a detached structure that meets every single one of the standards for a detached ADU. And so that means that if you've got an existing structure that doesn't meet even one of those standards, it can't be converted into an ADU. And as Gertie said, you can build a garage like much closer to your neighbor, like right at the property line, really technically under existing rules. And you'll see lots of garages out there that are built that way. But if the garage is built that way, then it could never be converted into an ADU because of that rule we have in the code now. What we've talked about is essentially what I think you were saying, Gertie, which is that the rule gets adjusted so that technically you could reuse that garage, but where you were putting the ADU would have to meet all of the ADU rules, which means that, like, if you were building a second story, the second story would have to meet the bulk plane and the setbacks for an ADU. So you're not building that right at the property line, but you could keep the garage where it was. Is that kind of what you were saying?
Well, what I was thinking of more, because there's at least one neighbor who was a couple of years ago contacted me. A person who was building a new house wanted to build a new garage and put an ADU on top. And my question was not reusing an existing garage, which we've had that in our neighborhood also, but they've gone to the Board of Adjustment and gotten a variance, and it's been easy peasy. But the new garage with a new ADU on top of it, the rear structure has to be set back 5 feet on both sides. And what it does is mean there's a 5 foot space on the south side of the garage and a 5 foot space on the north side of the garage, which is useless as off-street parking. So if the garage could be extended, the first floor out to the lot line, and then the second floor brought in to allow sunlight, open space, etc., more openness, into the backyards, not only of the of the houses, that to me would make sense.
Yeah, okay, so I think I understand. So, right, if under the existing rules and actually under future rules, according to all the things we've talked about, you would, in fact, if you were just building something new, just have to meet all the rules for an ADU, even when it, you know, had a garage at the ground floor, meaning it would have to be set back in more than if you were just building
Yeah.
a garage. But I think that's like a really good thing to think about, is if we could come up with something nuanced enough to say, like, actually the portion that's for the garage can meet the garage rules, as long as the portion that's for the unit is, you know, further away from the neighbor and is allowing the sunlight and all of that, then that could be a good thing, both for reuse of existing structures and for building new ones most flexibly, and avoid just like leaving wasted space.
Okay, I'm going to give Bruce a chance to ask. I really don't get your question here. Do you want to state it, Bruce?
It looks like Abe answered the basic question, though.
Okay.
I'm not real crazy about that answer. I would not like walking grandsons along a stretch of sidewalk where there had never been curb cuts before. Now all of a sudden they are, and there could be fences and trees and so forth in the way that you can't see like you can normally down the street where the garage is level with the house. So, but Abe answered the question. This came up when I saw one presentation before council in the neighborhood north of me that was considering a curb cut along a side yard stretch of sidewalk. I don't think that one passed, or actually maybe that one ended up getting pulled by the applicant for various reasons.
Yeah, and we're with you, like, as planners, of me personally to Bruce, like that when there's any way to avoid creating new curb cuts across the sidewalk, we really want to do that. It's just better for pedestrians. It's safer.
Good.
So I have just a couple of my own sort of, I don't know if they're really questions or comments, but with the group living, I saw this, you know, oh, we're going to increase the number of housing. We're going to stop displacement, get people off the street. Obviously, we have no data that happened, according to Webb's presentation. This, the same thing. What we seem to be doing is forgetting that what Cashman said a couple of years ago, we could just be a medium-sized city. We don't have to be the cream of the crop, most densely populated, attract every industry here to survive. But we are, the way that Blueprint is being interpreted, we seem to be going in that direction. I'm also concerned about, you know, I've been to a few of the INC presentations on the heat islands and the terrible concentration of heat in areas like downtown and areas that don't have lawns or parks. And all I can think about when I hear this garage, you know, the garage will cover more of the area, and we want to give them the ability to go up, because then maybe they, on the ADU, they won't cover so much space. I don't see where we're factoring in permeability, the heat island issues. We just seem to be on one track. That's my, you know, what I'm worried about. And I'm also worried about the investor angle, which we can't get CPD to give us any statistics on. None. You know, what proportion of the city is now investor owned and rental property, and we're displacing at a higher and higher rate. So I guess I just don't see that even this tool is helping with displacement. Aurora has 16% now African-American population, and Denver's down to like 9%. So we're losing on that front, and nobody wants to see that. So
Thanks, Christine. Yeah, we need to, you know, obviously we're struggling, and I think we're trying to take a balanced approach that, absolutely Denver does not need to be San Francisco or certainly New York or even Portland. And yet we also just see the consequences of like not tackling this at all. So we're trying a lot of different things basically to balance this. Like, can we have greater housing opportunity in neighborhoods that are still going to basically just feel like single unit neighborhoods across most of the city and things like that? And the expanding housing affordability project that I mentioned is a big one. We've got just much higher affordable housing project requirements across the city. And with group living, I think like that was another one where, there were just existing rules were creating some challenges and could potentially have resulted in displacement. But changing those rules, I don't think there's an expectation that suddenly everything is better. And that's true of the ADUs project too, that what you would see, I think, what you'll probably continue to see in the assessment reports for group living and for this project, if it were to pass, is slow change, very slow change. That is the most likely outcome.
Gertie, did you put your hand up again, or is that from before?
I put my hand up again.
Okay.
I just want to sort of second Chris's concern about long-term environmental sustainability, because what I see happening is and I am commending the front porch and landscaping residential whatever overlay that the Cherry Creek folks have developed that requires live plants in the landscaping, because what I see happening is very disturbing. The number of places that are now landscaping with rock, and they're landscaping around existing mature or almost mature trees. And everything that I know as an amateur tree hugger is that trees do not thrive when they are landscaped with rock. It does not help them. And another concern I have is that the current lot size, the developable area on a lot size in an SU zone or a TU zone is such that it is really hard to have a backyard tree. And yes, Denver's urban forest that the city is concerned about, or that city forestry is concerned about, is that what the city forestry department is responsible for, which is parks and street trees. But it's these backyard trees that have done a whole lot to keep our neighborhoods cooler, provide clean air, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And CPD, in my opinion, has totally ignored the importance of open space on individual properties and ways to incentivize people to have growing living things that are making our city a better place to live.
Thanks, Gertie. And yeah, I think like absolutely we know we need to do more on all of these fronts. Like and it can seem, and it is partly true, that it's like we're taking things on kind of separate from each other. Like we're talking about ADUs, we're not talking about urban heat islands, and all these other things. And yes, all of these things are very related and we need to consider them, but we also just have a really hard time if we don't bite things off in somewhat more manageable chunks in terms of getting feedback on them. But I will assure you that like we're talking to our climate action and sustainability folks and forestry folks about all the things we're doing. We're considering their feedback. They also are taking kind of lead positions on upcoming projects to like look at urban heat island effects and permeable surface cover and all of those, all the things that come out of those efforts would affect development generally, including accessory dwelling units. And the one last thing I'll say is just hopefully this will make you feel a little better is that you probably know there's a maximum building coverage that varies by zone lot size and district across the code. But in single unit districts, there's a maximum amount of the lot that you could cover with buildings. And we're not looking at changing that in the ADU project. And so it's all buildings, like primary building, accessory buildings, that absolute limit that's there now, you might think it's too high, but that it would stay there.
I'm not as concerned about it being too high. I'm concerned about it being able to spread out in meaningless ways along the side lot line, where it is ridiculous. I mean, you have a building that's set 5 feet back from the side lot line. That meets the code requirement, but then the backyard space is itty bitty tiny. And in many cases in the new developments, they're covered with concrete patios. So there's no permeable space to allow green things to grow. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like right now, that building coverage standard, it's just buildings. It's not all permeable or impervious surfaces. And that's something, as part of like climate considerations and landscaping considerations generally, like not just about ADUs, that, we need to be taking on as a city, I think.
So I have a hard stop at 12:30, but I see Jane, do you want to unmute yourself? I see you have a hand up.
I want to make an announcement about our meeting on October 8th, and I'm not trying to cut short your discussion. Okay to go on now? Thank you very much. Some of you probably know that over the years, the INC, along with the League of Women Voters, have worked with Channel 8 to provide election forums, both for candidates and ballot issues. And when COVID started, it made it impossible for all of us to get together and have those forums. So this year, Channel 8, the League of Women Voters, and INC will be recording some of these forums on issues that are coming up this fall. And INC is also going to be presenting a similar format at our meeting on October 8th. And it'll start at 9 o'clock. And the issues that will be presented are Ordinance 305, which is no eviction without representation. Ordinance 306, waste no more. Ordinance 307, Denver deserves sidewalks. And the state Proposition 121, state income tax rate reduction. So those will all be presented on October 8th at our regular delegate meeting, starting at 9 o'clock. Soshi Gaitan will be the moderator. The other ones that are going to be recorded at the Channel 8 studios will be available for viewing for the next few weeks. Thanks.
Thank you, Jane. And I just want to make, thank you, Abe, for coming today. I don't know how we're going to get recommendations to you since none really came out of this meeting, but I think you heard a lot of feedback. And I just want to announce that the next ZAP meeting, we had asked it's a new person. It's a person in charge left, but the committee called Advancing Equity in Rezoning, not zoning, but rezoning. They're going to return and give us an update on where that project is. And we are asking a joint project of Denver Transportation and CPD, a joint project to extend the, they're working on extending the temporary emergency regulations that went into effect during COVID for restaurants and maybe other merchants to use the property, the public right of way, and even in the street. It's very complicated. They have one portion of that project they're going to start with called Above the Curb. But we've invited them to come, and I'm hoping that they will be able to get this out to people because I had no idea it was this far along. So thank you all for coming, and I'll see you next month, and I'll see you on on the 8th, virtually. Thanks, Abe.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye all.